In this first case study, we're going to create a gritty pencil rendering type of brush. Now, if you've watched many of the Control Paint videos, you know that I love using so-called opacity brushes. And the basic hard round is a great example of this. The pressure controls in my stylus are controlling the flow and opacity of the brush, and the diameter stays fixed. So if I want to make a larger mark, I have to use keyboard shortcuts. But these brushes are awesome because they're easy to control, and especially when you combine them with an eraser, you can get some really smooth rendering. So opacity brushes are good. And my problem, the challenge that I want to solve with a new brush, is to have the best qualities of these opacity brushes combined with the grittiness of that pencil texture. Now, the heart of this series is going to exist in the brush palette. Any setting that I want to change on a brush is found in the window menu and open the brush palette. And this is like looking under the hood in the brush. So at its basic settings, you can see there's a little preview here on the right, and it looks like a simple stroke. And then as I turn on and off various brush properties on the left here with these checkboxes, I can pretty quickly change the look of this brush. You can see that is way different, and all I did was turn on two little check marks. So if I turn those back off, it should be back to normal. And I need to point out that if you're using an earlier version of Photoshop, the layout is going to look a little bit different on the brush palette. But know that most of the functionality has been exactly the same for years. So it might be a few differences here and there, but all the core features are the same. So let me change a few more settings here and make a brush that's totally different. Now, you might worry that this means I have permanently destroyed the basic round brush. Well, Photoshop actually doesn't let you do that. So at any time, I can activate the brush tool, right click, and pick the hard round brush, and it's back to normal. There's actually no way to permanently change the settings of any custom brush you've saved. Whenever you change various properties in the brush panel, all you're doing is temporarily modifying them. And selecting the save preset off the list will reset them all. So you can't mess up a brush. As you can see, there are a lot of options in this menu. There's a bunch of different checkboxes, each of which have a bunch of sub-options. But I want to keep my eye on the goal here. And my goal is making a textured pencil-looking brush. So the only thing I'm going to worry about here is the texture property. So I'll activate that by clicking this checkbox. And then you'll notice the content on the right side of the menu has changed. I have a few new options. And first off, there's a big swatch where I'm allowed to pick a pattern. And this prompts a list of all the saved patterns I have in my pattern library. So I'll pick a rock texture just for a second here. And you can see what this does is it blends the basic round with a bit of that rock texture from a photograph. And there are a variety of sliders that help define how exactly it blends. So here on the scale, I can choose how large is the repeat unit. If I move it to the left, the rock will appear much smaller. If I move it all the way to the right, it'll be a much larger repeat. Likewise, there's a thing called depth. This is how much is it going to blend with the original brush. Down at 50%, you can see there's a lot less of that rock look. If I move it all the way up to 100%, there'll be quite a bit more. So it's this image that's really going to sell the texture on our brush. This is a seamless repeating tile. And what that means is that it will repeat endlessly on both the X and Y axis, and you'll never see a seam. Here's an example of it done correctly, and here's an example of a bad tile. This has very obvious seams. This is what you want to avoid when you're making your own brushes. Now, if you want to know more about this, there's plenty of information on the internet. Just type in tiling texture tutorial, and I'm sure you'll find plenty. And if you don't want to make your own, I've actually included a folder full of seamless repeat tiles that you can use for any brushes you want. So go to town. And once I've got the nice seamless tile ready to go, it's time to tell Photoshop that this is going to be a pattern. So what I do is I select all, then go to the Edit menu, Define Pattern. And here I have an opportunity to give it a name, and I'll call it Pencil Texture A. So let's see what difference it makes adding this simple texture into my brush. Here's the basic brush. And notice that I've set the flow down to about 50%. So I'm going to be laying down a little less pigment than I was previously. Turn on the texture. Select my new Pencil Texture A pattern from my list. And give it a go. That is way better. You can see it's got some nice paper texture as well as some pencil marks right in there. And at this point, all that's left to do is to adjust the scale. Maybe I want it to repeat a little more often, so it's a bit of a tighter repeat. Work on the depth, and that's pretty much it. All right, I think I'm ready to call this one done. I need to save what's called a brush preset, and that's the same as custom brush. So I go to the bottom right-hand corner of my brush palette and click the New Brush Preset button. I give it a name, and then I say OK. And now I have a permanent copy of this brush. But it's important to get a sense for how Photoshop organizes these brushes. So if you can think about them like having offspring. So I began with the hard round, I made some modifications, and then I hit the New Brush button. Well, instead of saving those modifications permanently into the hard round brush, the hard round brush just spawned a child. It's sort of like the hard round, but with its own texture. So this is a whole new brush living on its own. As a result, the hard round is exactly the way it always was. And I might go on to use that hard round to make a variety of similar brushes, each with their own preset. So know that most brushes begin as a parent, get modified a bit, and then saved out as their own version, sort of like offspring. And as I mentioned earlier, it is impossible to permanently modify a brush you've already saved, so don't worry about messing something up when you change settings. So let's have a quick recap here. My design challenge here was to create a brush that feels very much like the hard round opacity brush that I'm used to, while simultaneously creating a gritty pencil look. So those were my requirements. I made sure to look at reference, have the goal in mind, and not add in any unnecessary features. And what I ended up with was a brush that works really well. It's got a nice subtle texture to it, although it still behaves in a way that I'm very familiar with. So this is a very useful brush. It's not gimmicky, it just works. And in my opinion, this is where brush design is at its finest. It gives you a very custom solution to a personal challenge. And you know exactly how the brush should operate because you made it yourself. This is way better than downloading somebody else's brush and using it as your own.